From 1945 to 1950, the world shifted between two eras, propeller and jet. On the decks of aircraft carriers, the F-6F Hellcat had just ended its legendary role when the jet-powered F-9F Panther appeared. Speed increased, thrust grew stronger, but the landing decks remained relics of the old war designed for aircraft to land at 70 knots, not 125 knots. According to a note in Naval Design Memorandum 1949, the ship changed its planes, but not its deck. The carrier remained loyal to its straight deck, while the new engines turned every landing into a test at the limits of physics and survival. Technology advanced too quickly, beyond the pace of human adaptation. The consequences did not take long to appear. Within 12 months, the Royal Navy lost 43 aircraft, with 17 pilots killed. Each number was recorded coldly in the Royal Navy Flight Safety Review 1951, accompanied by the remark, "Losses occurred during the final 30 seconds of flight." Across the Atlantic, the situation was even worse. According to the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics Annual Report 1951, there were 776 Class A incidents, meaning accidents that caused fatalities or complete aircraft loss, an average of more than 2 deaths per day in peacetime. Not in battle, but during landings. A technical officer noted, "We lost more men to the deck than to the enemy." And in dimly lit meeting rooms, reports were still presented, signed and filed away. No one objected, because the numbers had become routine. The deck structure at the time was a fixed equation: 60 feet to stop, 4 arresting wires, 2.1 seconds left if a pilot overshot. Beyond the steel barrier stood rows of aircraft waiting to take off, fuel storage, and ammunition carts. If the barrier broke, the entire hangar deck could become an inferno within seconds. Accident Report 3/1951. USS Kearsarge recorded. Barrier failed under full power impact, resulting in detonation of gasoline stores. 14 aircraft destroyed, 11 dead, 23 injured, carrier operations suspended for 48 hours. These numbers were so similar that they could be copied from one report to another. Data showed the cause did not lie with the pilots, but with the structure itself. Yet the statistical tables continued to be signed off, coldly, as an administrative habit. The difference of the jet age lay in its engines. In the propeller era, a pilot could cut throttle and descend onto the deck like a bird landing. But with the Panther or Banshee, jet engines required 7 seconds to reach full thrust, a lifetime when plunging toward the sea at 125 knots. A minor deviation in the approach angle could mean death. Pilots were forced to maintain steady power upon touchdown, meaning they approached the carrier at full thrust, hoping only to catch the arresting wire. If they missed, there was no time to accelerate. Under such conditions, accidents were no longer risks, but predictable probabilities. According to the Office of Naval Operations Briefing 1950, current flight deck geometry allows zero margin of error for jet approach. In other words, the carrier's design demanded absolute perfection from pilots. But in an environment where sea winds shifted every second and the ship rolled with each wave, perfection could not exist. The engineers knew this, yet none were permitted to write otherwise. Every report ended with the phrase, "pilot error," a ritual absolving the system of responsibility. In the closed rooms of the British Admiralty, the typewriters clattered steadily. Reports were bound into volumes labelled, "For internal reference only." No one asked why fatalities kept rising despite increasingly strict procedures. The answer was not in engineering language, but in psychology. The ships that had won the war were national symbols, and symbols could not be changed. A young engineer in Farnborough wrote in his diary, "We built our ships to fight the enemy, not to protect our pilots." That technical crisis did not erupt with an explosion, but spread quietly, like a crack in steel. Each number, each report, was a warning ignored. By 1951, more than 1,000 British, American pilots had been injured in landing accidents, yet no newspaper reported it. The statistics were submitted, classified, and stacked upon each other, and in that silence naval aviation began to die. In the list of thousands of officers of the Royal Navy after 1945, the name Dennis Campbell passes by like a faint line. He was born in 1907 inches South Sea, enlisted before turning 18, and once flew the slow fairy Swordfish carrying torpedoes under its wings in the pursuit of the Bismarck. That action earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, a reward for bravery in a war that had already ended. But after peace returned, Dennis Campbell was not assigned to the fleet. Instead, he was transferred to the Ministry of Supply, where he became a liaison officer between the Navy and civilian contractors. A desk, a few contracts, and technical meetings. It was said to be a position for officers retired but not gone. No one thought that man could change naval history. According to the 1,949 personnel record of the Royal Navy Personnel Office, Campbell held no engineering degree, did not belong to the design division, and was only responsible for monitoring the progress of parts production. He had a habit of keeping every report from technical drawings to accident lists and scribbling notes in pencil along the margins. He read numbers the way some men read weather, a colleague later said. In the room that smelled of wood and engine oil, Campbell began to see those numbers forming a strange repeating pattern: takeoff time, braking distance, barrier position, death rate. They all said the same thing, but no one would listen. In March 1951, he attended the funeral of test pilot Michael Lithgow, who had once been trained by him to fly Swordfish aircraft during the war. Lithgow died aboard HMS Implacable after a perfect landing speed and approach angle both within the allowable limits, yet still slipped past the arrestor wire. According to accident report 1,951 divided by Implacable, pilot performance within standard tolerance, barrier failed to engage. Campbell stood in the back row, saying nothing. In his diary, he wrote briefly, "He did everything right." As the coffin was lowered, a cold thought appeared. If a man who followed every procedure could still die, then the fault no longer belonged to humans. It was the fault of the system, of the design, of the numbers accepted without question. Back in London, Campbell began collecting accident reports from 1,945 to 1,950, requesting copies from the Fleet Air Arm Safety Office and the U.S. Naval Aviation Division. For 3 weeks, he compiled statistics, calculating the accident frequency per 100 landings, grouping them by aircraft type. The result: 1 accident for every 21 landings, a number far too high for peacetime. In the summary note he sent to his superiors, he wrote, "The system tolerates 1 death per 21 landings and calls it acceptable risk." No one replied, but to Campbell, that moment felt like discovering a cruel law of nature. For the first time, data was no longer a lifeless chart, it was evidence of industrial guilt. "Numbers are not neutral," he wrote on the margin. "They tell us what we choose to ignore." From then on, Campbell changed the way he looked at every blueprint. He no longer sought human error, but structural error. One night in August 1951, on the train from Portsmouth to London, he opened his notebook and drew a diagram of a flight deck with a blue ink pen. The train vibrated lightly along the rails, the carriage light shining on the page with slanted words. "If you can't make it longer, angle it." The idea was so simple it was almost laughable. Instead of lengthening the landing deck, tilt it 10 degrees to the port side, so that when a pilot missed the arrestor wire, the aircraft would veer off toward the sea instead of crashing into the barrier. According to Campbell's preliminary calculation, angling the deck created an additional safety margin of 150 feet, increasing the pilot's survival chance by 70%. The last note he underlined twice that night read, "The margin of error must include the right to survive." It was not the intuition of an old officer, but the conclusion of a man who had read too many death reports. The numbers did not lie. Someone only needed to listen. When the train stopped at Waterloo Station, Campbell closed his notebook, slipped it into his leather case, and stepped onto the rain-wet platform. No one noticed the middle-aged man leaving the carriage. But inside his case, on a page with a faint blue diagonal line, the course of world naval history had just changed direction. On the morning of the 7th of August 1951, the meeting room of the British Ministry of Supply glowed pale under fluorescent light. A long wooden table, piles of files, and technical maps spread across its surface. 8 men sat around it, representatives of the Royal Navy, naval engineers, and legal advisors. At the centre, Dennis Campbell opened his briefcase and drew out a hand-sketched sheet. Faint blue lines divided the flight deck into 2 directions, forming a 10-degree angle toward the port side. He said simply, "If a pilot misses the wire, he'll veer out to sea instead of crashing into the barrier." The room fell silent for a few seconds, then came the sound of chairs scraping and papers rustling. A maritime law officer replied coolly, "That concept violates the International Air Navigation Convention 1936. All takeoff and landing operations must align with the ship's longitudinal axis. This cannot proceed." Campbell nodded and turned the page, but the eyes around the room had already closed to him. According to the minutes of meeting, Ministry of Supply, the 8th of July 1951, the first to react sharply was Commander James, a flight operations specialist. He said, "Carriers roll and pitch around their keel. If you land across that motion, you'll fight the ship itself." The statement was recorded verbatim. No one in the room cared about the data charts Campbell had brought. They trusted their own experience more than any graph. He stood still, hand resting on the drawing, knowing that the numbers before them had less weight than 10 years of naval habit. When the debate reached an impasse, another voice rose from the end of the table. Lewis Boddington, a civilian engineer from the Naval Air Department at Farnborough, pushed his round glasses up his nose and spoke slowly. "You argue from instinct. He argues from data. Who should we trust?" The air froze. Boddington turned to Campbell. "Do you have mathematical proof?" Campbell answered, "I have real data, no equations." Boddington paused for a few seconds, then said, "Then let's turn it into an equation." He proposed redrawing the model on HMS Triumph, without altering its structure, only painting a white line angled 10 degrees, allowing pilots to conduct simulated landings. If it fails, we lose a few cans of paint. If it works, we save hundreds of lives. According to Royal Aircraft Establishment Memo 1951 divided by Trial 1, the test was approved within 48 hours. HMS Triumph left Portsmouth with a white line painted diagonally across its deck. No mechanical changes whatsoever. Over 3 weeks, dozens of touch-and-go maneuvers were carried out. Pilots were instructed to approach along the new angled line without lowering their wheels. Each pass, they adjusted approach angles, checked visibility, and simulated wire miss scenarios. Data were recorded with high-speed cameras and gyroscopic oscillation meters. Test report 1951 divided by Triumph trials concluded. No measurable drift observed. Pilot adaptation achieved after 2 landings. Not a single accident, not a single deviation. Pilot Peter Chilton, who took part in the trials, recalled in his memoir Carrier Pilot's Notebook, "The first time I came in too high and thought I'd made a mistake. But instead of panic, I pushed the throttle and went around. There was no barrier ahead, only air and sea. The sense of freedom was unbelievable." Those words were later quoted in the British Aviation Journal 1952 as evidence that Campbell's idea carried a psychological value beyond measure. In the official records, the pilot's reactions were summarized more briefly. Pilot feedback: positive. When the final report was sent to the Ministry of Supply, the first page contained only 4 lines. Test platform, HMS Triumph. Duration, 3 weeks. Total approaches, several dozen. Accident rate, 0. No commentary, no conclusion. Just 4 clean, cold figures, enough to shake a doctrine that had stood for 10 years. According to the summary of Technical Correspondence 1951, Campbell made no further remarks in the following meeting. He placed the report on the table and left before anyone could respond. A clerk later wrote in his private diary, "He said nothing. The data spoke for him." The story ended that way, no applause, no praise. But But within those silent numbers, an era of carrier aviation had begun to shift. In the history of engineering, revolutions rarely begin with gunfire. Sometimes they begin with a white-painted line and a report bearing the words, "Accident rate, 0." And in that silence, the numbers won their first battle. Before moving on to the next section, if this story resonates with you, please like and share so more people can see it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every word from you inspires us to create more great videos. In September 1951, inside a meeting room at the Patuxent River Naval Air Test Center, Maryland, 40 test officers of the U.S. Navy sat in rows under the glaring white lights. On the presentation platform, Eric Brown, test pilot of the Royal Navy, set his leather briefcase on the table. He looked around and said slowly, "Gentlemen, I have made 63 landings on an angled deck, and I am still standing here." The opening line made little impression, but when he spread the diagram across the table, the room began to buzz. An 8-degree portside angled deck, an idea from the British, was considered mad, even dangerous. Meeting log. U.S. Naval Air Test Center, 14 divided by 9 divided by 1951, recorded the initial reaction. Laughter, disbelief, multiple objections raised. A young officer whispered, "They want us to land sideways." The atmosphere tightened like an arrestor cable. Brown, who had held the record for landings on more than 400 aircraft types, kept his voice steady. On an angled deck, if a pilot misses the wire, he doesn't die. He can throttle up and fly again. The sound of a chair scraping sharply filled the room. Commander Harold Buell, leader of Squadron VF-84, stood up. "We're not throwing away 8 years of experience for a British drawing." Brown looked straight at him. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to believe the data. According to technical note No. 43/1951, Brown presented a comparison between two deck types. Straight deck, 1,327 landings, 52% accidents due to barriers. Angled deck, 0 accidents, 0 casualties. Buell stepped closer to the projector screen, voice rising. "You're telling us to rewrite an entire doctrine based on a few weeks of testing?" Brown replied, "Not a few weeks, but 3 months of continuous data from HMS Triumph, all documented with high-speed cameras and pilot reports." Some American officers shook their heads, others silently took notes. The tension escalated when the Americans cited their own achievements. Admiral Alfred Pride, head of the Bureau of Aeronautics, spoke up. "We've developed the Davis barrier system, worth $3.2 million USD, with a 98.7% success rate. We don't need an angled deck." Brown raised his head, the light reflecting off his glasses onto his forehead. "Admiral, 98.7% of the ones who survived, or 98.7% of the ones who died?" The entire room fell silent. That question wasn't in any report, yet it froze the air. For a few seconds, the ceiling fan was the only sound. "1 U.S." officer wrote in his notebook, "Moment of silence, followed by confusion. Data integrity challenged." Brown continued, his voice hoarse. "You measure barrier efficiency. I measure pilot survival. We are not the same kind of statistics." Ho! According to the summary report, Patuxent Conference 1951, after 40 minutes of debate, Rear Admiral Apollo Susek, commander of U.S. naval forces in London, stood up. He said, "I have witnessed the trials myself. The British data are consistent. We should test it." That sentence marked the end of the argument, but Pride was not ready to yield. If this idea causes even one casualty, the program will be terminated, and everyone involved will be held accountable. Susek merely nodded. Agreed. Then he turned to the recorder. "Enter into the record-angled deck test on USS Midway. Paint trial only. No structural modification." The meeting room door opened, and a draft of cold air drifted in from the corridor. Brown gathered his charts and slid them back into his case. He knew the real battle had only just begun. The men in that room did not doubt physics. They doubted their pride. The U.S. Naval Aviation History Archive later quoted him saying, "I wasn't fighting them, I was fighting tradition." 3 weeks later, USS Midway, CV-41, departed Norfolk Harbour with an 8-degree white line painted along its deck. The test was given a simple name, Paint Trial Number 1. According to flight test record, November 1951, 26 pilots were selected to perform over 200 simulated approaches, all captured on film. The results: 0 collisions, 0 deviations, 100% successful approach adjustments after 2 attempts. Memo of December 1951 recorded Admiral Pride's final reaction. Results verified. Further evaluation authorized. Just 90 days later, the data was strong enough to convince the U.S. Naval Board to approve the conversion of USS Antietam, CV-36, into the world's first angled deck aircraft carrier. No speech was read at the approval ceremony, only a marginal note in the minutes: concept proven, proceed to modification. From that meeting in Maryland, 2 things were remembered. First, Eric Brown made the entire American system listen through the persistence of data. Second, for the first time in naval aviation history, an idea did not emerge from power, but from a spreadsheet. And in that silence, the Americans finally agreed to test the impossible. On the morning of the 12th of January 1953, the waters off Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, lay silent beneath a grey mist. On the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Antietam, CV-36, American and British engineers stood on both sides, observing an experiment unprecedented in naval history. Beneath their feet was a newly welded steel surface, angled 8 degrees to the port side, its end no longer facing the barrier, but opening toward the sea. Overhead, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell's F-9 F-5 Panther circled in preparation for landing. Buell was a veteran test pilot who had performed 43 carrier landings, survived 2 barrier collapses, and still bore the scar from a 1,949 crash on his arm. "Panther Ball 3.2, Roger Ball," came the controller's voice over the radio. Buell adjusted the stick, lowered his landing gear, and took a deep breath. Speed, 125 knots, altitude dropping fast. When the signal light on the ship's stern turned from red to amber, he brought the throttle to mid-range. Everything was by the book. Then, in an instant, a gust of wind from the right lifted the aircraft's nose 6 feet above the glide path. On deck, the landing signal officer raised the wave-off flag. Buell understood, but instead of cutting power as he always had before, he recalled the single instruction from training: if you miss the wires, add power, hold course, go around. Oh, the Panther hit the deck, tail scraping, hook catching wires #2, #3, then #4, and missed them all. On a straight deck, this moment would have meant impact, explosion, and death. But here, ahead of him, was open space. Buell slammed the throttle forward. The J-48 jet engine roared, taking 6 seconds to reach full thrust, 6 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Spray burst upward as the ship's stern dipped into a wave. The Panther climbed, lifting away from the deck, leaving a white trail against the blue sea. Below, no one spoke. Only the radio crackled. Missed all 4 wires, airborne again. And in that silence, for the first time, a pilot who missed the wires lived. Buell re-entered the pattern, circled for 23 seconds, and made his second approach. This time he kept the nose lower, touched down softly, caught wire #3, and stopped neatly after 250 feet. According to flight log, USS Antietam, 1953, it was the first perfect landing ever made on a true angled deck. When he climbed out, his hands were still trembling. A young officer asked, "How does it feel, sir?" Buell smiled. "For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to land." In the days that followed, testing continued with Carrier Air Group 8. Over 60 days, the pilots performed 1,327 landings, recording 8 bolters missed wire go-arounds. The results, in the U.S. Naval Air Test Center record 1950, stated 0 accidents, 0 fatalities, 0 aircraft damaged. An unbelievable statistic. On a straight deck, with equivalent frequency, there would have been 5 explosions, at least 1 to 2 dead pilots, and 2 aircraft destroyed. When the report reached Washington, its title was written in bold: First operational evaluation of angled deck completed. 100% pilot survivability. The final note read simply, Recommendation. Adopt as standard. According to the Bureau of Aeronautics Annual Review 1953, this data was recognized as the greatest humanitarian achievement in the history of U.S. naval engineering. From those numbers, the entire system began to change. Between 1,950, 1,952, the U.S. Navy averaged 647 accidents per year, with 52% occurring during landing. After the angled deck was officially adopted, between 1,955, 1,957, annual accidents dropped to 321, and landing-related incidents fell to 19%. According to the Naval Safety Center report 1957, this represented a 75% reduction in total accidents and an 80% reduction in barrier-related fatalities. A note scribbled in the margin of the summary read, Statistically, this line saved more lives than any weapon we ever built. But the numbers did not capture everything that changed on deck. The familiar scenes of past years burning aircraft, decks blanketed in smoke, firefighters sprinting through alarms gradually disappeared. In their place came the steady hum of jet engines and landings that unfolded like equations. Young pilots felt the difference even in their nerves. One of them, Lieutenant Peter Chilton, who had taken part in the HMS Triumph trials, wrote in his memoir, For the first time, we felt the deck was on our side. The data from USS Antietam was no longer a technical exercise. It had become evidence of a new philosophy. Design must serve life. Until then, all naval aviation doctrine rested on the assumption of an acceptable loss rate. Campbell had never accepted that. To him, engineering reached its true height only when it turned risk into survival. Royal Navy Memorandum 1954 noted, The angled deck embodies the moral principle that human error should not equal death. After the results were confirmed, Campbell received an invitation from the U.S. Navy to attend USS Antietam's commissioning ceremony. He declined, sending only a telegram. The proof belongs to the pilots. Across the Atlantic, Eric Brown represented Britain, stepping onto the deck alongside American engineers. He recalled Campbell's words from 1951. We're murdering them with our own equipment. Now, that same equipment was saving them. Months later, Lieutenant James Davidson, one of the test pilots, wrote a handwritten letter to Campbell. The letter, archived in Naval Aviation Archives, file 432, began, Sir, I never met you, but I owe you my life. Davidson described his flight on the 8th of March 1953, when his Panther's hydraulic system failed no brakes, no flaps. Landing speed had to increase by 20 knots, reaching 145 knots, beyond technical limits. On a straight deck, he would have gone into the sea or into the barrier, but Antietam had an angled deck. Davidson made 4 approaches, missed 3 wires, caught wire #4 on the 4th, stopping 11 feet from the edge. He wrote, I'm alive to write this because you dared to listen to the numbers. My daughter was born last month. Thank you. The letter was sent to the Ministry of Supply and reached Campbell's desk. There was no official reply, only a penciled note in the margin. Pilot #432 survived. Later, when Eric Brown asked why he hadn't answered, Campbell replied quietly, I never answered statistics. In truth, the USS Antietam report closed a chapter in the history of naval aviation. After that experiment, no one questioned the value of the angled deck again. It proved that data could save lives, that engineers could do the work of doctors, preventing death through logic and compassion. According to the Naval Engineering Review 1956, the angled deck changed not only the geometry of flight, but the ethics of design. In the final photograph of the trials, Campbell was not present. In the frame, pilots Buell and Davidson shake hands, the white diagonal line gleaming behind them on the grey steel deck. They smile lightly as the noon sun glints off their visors. No one speaks, but all know they have stepped out of an era when human life was a footnote to technology. For the first time, engineering had proved that compassion could be measured in data, and in that silence, the numbers became human. In 1955, the North Sea was covered in a cold, steely hue as HMS Ark Royal departed from Devonport for her first trial run. This was a ship designed entirely anew from keel to flight deck, incorporating an 8-degree angled structure, the direct result of over 4 years of debate, experimentation, and pages of reports from USS Antietam. According to the Royal Navy Engineering Journal 1955, Ark Royal was the first carrier built from the keel up with an angled flight deck. Every detail of the vessel reflected a shift in thinking. The arrestor cables were offset to port, and a new optical landing guidance system was installed at the ship's stern, allowing pilots to align visually instead of relying solely on deck officers. In the commissioning report, the final line read, "No further evaluation required. Concept proven operational." This was the moment when data became doctrine. It was no longer the experiment of a British officer, nor the trial project of an American engineering team. It became the official doctrine of the entire NATO bloc. Fleet Air Arm Circular 1955 mandated that all new or refitted carriers must include a minimum 8-degree angled deck. From a single white line, Campbell's idea became a design standard. One engineer from the Ark Royal construction team noted, "It's not a modification anymore, it's the baseline." While Britain completed Ark Royal across the Atlantic, the US Navy began implementing a series of parallel improvements. The Essex-class and Midway-class carriers were upgraded to include similar angled configurations. In 1956, the USS Forrestal, America's first supercarrier, was launched featuring all 3 major innovations: the angled deck, steam catapults, and an optical landing system. According to the U.S. Naval Engineering Report 1956, statistics from the first year of operation showed that landing accidents reduced to 0.19 per 100 sorties, the lowest figure in U.S. naval aviation history. A small footnote in the report added, "Angled deck contributes most significantly to survivability improvement." The design's effectiveness spread faster than any diplomatic strategy. In 1957, the French Navy completed the conversion of the Clemenceau, and Australia launched HMS Melbourne, both featuring the 8-degree portside angle per NATO standard. That same year, Japan, though no longer operating carriers, sent a team of engineers to Portsmouth to observe and replicate the design for its jet pilot training program. The Commonwealth Defence Review 1957 recorded the first official use of the term angled deck standard. No, the expansion was driven not only by data, but by trust. Once partner nations agreed on a single number, 8 degrees ceased to be a technical specification and became a symbol of safety itself. From then on, every new design began with the same question. Angle confirmed. The default answer, yes. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was also watching closely. During the 1950 seconds, the Soviet Navy operated early Varyag and Admiral Kuznetsov-class carriers with straight decks, suffering a series of accidents similar to those once faced by the Americans. According to declassified records from 1993 in 1959, after multiple MiG-15 UTI crash landings, Soviet engineers secretly tested an angled deck on a Baltic prototype vessel. 6 months later, the Soviet Naval Aviation Technical Bulletin 1960 recorded, landing accidents reduced by 68% after geometric modification. There was no public announcement, no acknowledgement of Campbell or Britain, but the data spoke for itself. The Comparative Flight Safety Study 1962 by the Soviets concluded, The angled deck improves not only geometry but pilot psychology. During the same period, barrier systems on Soviet carriers were gradually phased out and replaced by run-out zones, directly copied from American designs. In the midst of the Cold War, both blocks relied on the same principle born in 1951 to give human error a way out. By the mid-1960s, the world had entered what engineers called the age of proof. Every design decision now required quantitative evidence. The statistical quality control system, once a tool of American industry, was integrated directly into naval and aerospace engineering. According to the Defense Production Review 1964, the angled deck became the first case where statistical validation replaced tradition in military engineering. From then on, every trial came with charts, standard deviations, and success probabilities, replacing the old saying, "We've always done it this way." In 1975, when the USS Nimitz was officially commissioned, the U.S. Navy declared during the decommissioning ceremony of the old Midway, all operational carriers worldwide now feature the same deck angle, 8 degrees to port. According to the Naval Construction Bureau Summary 1975, there were 47 active carriers globally at that time, and all of them used the angled configuration. The world's technical blueprints had become so uniform that there was no longer a distinction between East and West. In his 1976 address at the Royal Maritime Institute, military historian Professor Alan Murray said, "When the right idea becomes standard, we stop remembering who first drew the line." That sentence captured the essence of the era. Data had triumphed over power, but in doing so, it had erased human traces. No one mentioned Dennis Campbell or Louis Boddington in later technical documents. They simply called it the 8-degree principle. According to the U.S. Naval Safety Division Report 1977, global landing accident rates had fallen by over 80% compared to 1952. The training programs of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were based on the same model. Even China, when building the Liaoning at the end of the 20th century, retained the original 8-degree angle from the Soviet design. From 1955 to 1975, in just 2 decades, the world moved from skepticism to total standardization. A small, slanted line had become the backbone of global naval aviation. In engineering terms, it was a closed-loop validation, a complete cycle from hypothesis to data and from data to doctrine. And as the numbers kept updating, the essence of the revolution remained unchanged. Data has no nationality, and truth requires no justification. In that age, every report looked almost identical. The first page noted the 8 degrees angle, the last always ended with the same line, accident rate, 0. And in the silence of those statistical tables, the world understood that the debate was over. The proof had become the world itself. As the world entered the full jet age, Rear Admiral Dennis Campbell quietly left the Navy. He attended no inaugurations, appeared in no television features about the angled deck. In 1960, he officially retired, declining the British Admiralty's invitation to write a memoir. Instead, Campbell accepted a position as a technical consultant at Hawker Siddeley Aviation, overseeing flight safety projects. In his small office in Hatfield, surrounded by aircraft models and design drawings, he would often pause before the whiteboard and write a simple question for the young engineers. If it fails at night, what will the pilot do? No one could answer immediately, and he would nod. Then we're not finished. To Campbell, safety was never absolute. It existed only when the designer imagined the worst possible moment. According to Hawker Siddeley Internal Memo 1962, Campbell required every experimental project to include a section titled Pilot Recovery Scenario, describing exactly how a pilot could survive if the system failed. One engineer recalled, "He didn't care about probability. He asked, if it happens, what will we say to the pilot's family?" In his 50s, he still came to the workshop every day, quietly checking blueprints, sometimes pausing to look at the Harrier, the first British vertical takeoff aircraft, as a symbol of his philosophy. Technology only matters when it gives people another chance to live. For the rest of his life, Campbell rarely spoke of the angled deck. He regarded it as a collective proof, evidence of what could be achieved when people listened to data. Yet each year, the numbers kept growing. According to the US Naval Operations Report 1975, an average of 15,000 carrier landings occurred annually on US ships, with about 8% bolters around 1,200 missed wires. On a straight deck, that would have meant 1,200 accidents, hundreds dead. But on an angled deck, those same numbers became 1,200 survivals. Over 70 years, by global estimate, more than 30,000 lives were preserved by his idea. The data was no longer a cold set of numbers, but a chart of compassion. A Naval Safety Center report from 1980 noted, "Every angle drawn in 1950, one continues to save lives daily." Young pilots no longer knew Campbell's name, yet they landed safely on the angled surfaces he had once sketched in blue ink. An engineer who met him in 1985 recalled, "When I told him the world had forgotten him, he smiled and said, 'That's how you know it worked.'" In April 2000, Campbell passed away at age 92 in his small home near Southsea. On his desk remained a faded angled deck drawing and a scrap of paper bearing the words, "Design for Forgiveness." They were the last two words he left behind. 6 years later, a letter arrived in his family's mailbox from the United States. The writer was Colonel Arthur Black, a Marine Corps pilot who had served from 1985 to 2007. In the letter he wrote, "I bolted 140, 2 times 140. 2 times I lived. You gave me 140, 2 chances to try again. I never met you, but every time I pushed the throttle, I thought of the man who gave me that chance." The Campbell family framed the letter and placed it in their living room beside a black and white photo of HMS Ark Royal, 1955. They never requested a posthumous medal. To them, that letter was reward enough. According to the Naval Aviation Memorial Records 2003, during the 50th anniversary of the angled deck, no long speeches were delivered. On the screen appeared only white text. 8 degrees, infinite lives. A full minute of silence followed. In the audience, aging pilots sat upright, hands gripping their helmets. One whispered, "He never needed our thanks. He only needed us to land safely." Today, every naval aviation design curriculum still opens with Admiral William Razor's 1945 quote, "We designed our carriers for propeller aircraft that could abort at the last second." But on the final page, another line has been added, not Razor's, but Campbell's. "We redesigned them so that error no longer meant death." That is the distance between past and present, between engineering and ethics. Campbell's career proved that science is not just calculation, but compassion made measurable. When an engineer asks why a number doesn't feel right, he is practicing conscience. And when data makes silence impossible, it ceases to be statistics, it becomes the voice of humanity. At a technical symposium in 2010, Professor Alan Murray concluded, "History doesn't belong to those with power, but to those who ask why." The history of the angled deck is not about victory, but about humility before human error. Campbell did not change the world through speeches or triumphs, but by listening to forgotten numbers. We may forget his name, yet with every safe landing, every 8-degree line drawn across a steel deck, his question still echoes. If it fails at night, what will the pilot do? Technical ethics begins in that moment when one number makes us unable to remain silent, and in that silence the data became mercy.